Karoline Leavitt was used to controversy. As one of the youngest political voices in America, she'd sparred with journalists, faced down biased panels, and walked out of press briefings with her head high. But this invitation felt different. It came from a suburban high school in Massachusetts. A public speaking event, nonpartisan, they claimed, meant to give students a chance to engage with active voices in modern politics. Most public figures would decline. Too unpredictable, too risky. But Karoline accepted. She remembered being a high schooler, quietly political, often dismissed, always underestimated. If there was a chance to reach even a few students who felt like she once did, it was worth it. Still, something about the tone of the email gnawed at her. "We welcome dialogue and honest debate," it read. "The students are encouraged to challenge ideas and ask freely." Challenge? That was putting it lightly. 2 nights before the event, Karoline's team sent her clips from the school's student-run podcast. One student in particular, Maya Ruiz, had gone viral for a monologue titled "Why We Shouldn't Give a Platform to People Like Karoline Leavitt." Charming. Her advisor Thomas called her after watching it. "This girl's smart," he said. "Sharp, emotional. She'll come at you hard." Karoline smiled slightly. "Then I'll listen harder." She didn't go there to fight. She went to show what real listening looked like. But when she stepped onto that auditorium stage, flanked by school officials and buzzing cameras, she quickly realized she wasn't just a guest. She was the target. The auditorium was packed. Over 400 students filled the seats, buzzing with anticipation. Phones were already recording. Some teachers leaned in quietly, wondering how long Karoline would last before the tough questions came. The principal greeted the crowd with nervous enthusiasm. "Let's welcome Ms. Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary and guest speaker for today's Civic Engagement Forum." Polite applause echoed through the hall. Respectful but distant. Karoline smiled anyway, walking across the stage with her signature calm confidence. Her blazer was sharp, her silver cross necklace glinting under the lights. She stood behind the podium and scanned the crowd. The front row caught her attention immediately. There she was, Maya Ruiz, arms crossed, eyes locked, expression unreadable. Beside her, a small group of students held notebooks, some with clear question sheets in hand. They weren't here for inspiration. They were here to challenge her. Karoline cleared her throat. "Thank you for the invitation. I've spent years speaking in press rooms, policy panels, and campaign halls, but nothing compares to being here, where the future sits, ready to shape its own ideas." A few murmurs. One teacher nodded. But most students just watched, waiting. Karoline continued, talking about her journey from high school student to Capitol Hill, about taking unpopular stances, about speaking up when it was easier to stay quiet. Then came the Q&A, and Maya's hand shot up first. The microphone was passed to her. "Ms. Leavitt, I'd like to know, how do you justify working for an administration that many of us believe hurt marginalized communities?" Silence. A few students nodded. A few held their breath. Others started recording. Karoline looked directly at her, not defensive, not dismissive. "That's a fair question," she said calmly, "and I'll give you a real answer." The room was still. She had come prepared. But no one, especially Maya, was prepared for how she would answer. Karoline let the silence hang for a moment. Not to delay, but to honor the weight of the question. She stepped away from the podium slightly, her voice calm and clear. "When I took that role, I knew there would be moments like this, moments where people would ask, 'How could you?' And the honest answer is, I believed it was better to be inside the room fighting for what I believe than to sit outside shouting about it. Some students blinked. She had expected eye rolls. Instead, she saw curiosity. I don't agree with every decision that's ever been made by anyone I've worked with. But I know this. If you step away from every table where you disagree, there won't be anyone left with your voice at the table. A few murmurs spread through the room. Even Maya was listening now, her brows slightly furrowed, but the defensive posture easing. I worked for an administration that was flawed, like every administration, but I also worked to bring attention to the people who were never being heard. And if I left that job because it was hard or controversial, then I'd be proving the people who underestimated me right. The room was still. Some students lowered their phones, choosing to actually watch. If you believe in justice, Karoline added, don't just post about it. Don't just shout from outside. Find a way into the rooms where the decisions are made. And when you get there, stay. There was no applause yet, but something had shifted. Even Maya didn't respond right away. Her fingers, once poised to fire back, now hovered over her notepad, hesitating. For the first time, the auditorium didn't see Karoline as the other side. They saw her as someone who understood the pressure of conviction. And she had more to say. The moderator, a senior civics teacher named Mr. Halbrook, stood frozen behind his clipboard. He had expected the moment to be tense, perhaps even explosive. Instead, it was quiet and unexpectedly respectful. Karoline turned back to the audience, this time choosing not to wait for another question. Before I take the next one, she said, I want to talk about something I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Now, the auditorium leaned in. When I was 17, I thought being strong meant always having the last word. I thought you had to argue your way to being right. But now I believe strength is being willing to be questioned and still show up. She scanned the front row again. Maya's pen was moving slowly now. Not furious, just thoughtful. The truth is, many of you may never agree with me, and that's okay. But I'm not here to change your beliefs. I'm here to challenge the idea that disagreement has to equal disrespect. That hit harder than expected. A girl in the back, previously whispering to her friend, lowered her phone completely. A boy near the aisle nodded once, almost unconsciously. You don't have to change your values to listen, Karoline added. And listening doesn't mean surrendering. It means growing. There was something disarming about her tone. She wasn't performing. She was reflecting, sharing, letting them see the version of herself that wasn't just a press secretary or a political headline. She was a person who remembered what it felt like to sit where they were, and to be underestimated. Maya slowly raised her hand again. So, she asked carefully, do you regret anything from your time in that role? Karoline looked her in the eye and nodded once. Yes, I regret the moments I stayed silent, when I should have spoken up sooner. And with that one sentence, the air shifted again. Because now, the room wasn't waiting for her to fail. They were beginning to root for her. Maya's second question had been a turning point. What was meant to press Karoline, even expose her, ended up revealing something else entirely. Honesty. Karoline's admission that she regretted not speaking up sooner hung in the air like a confession that no one expected from a political figure, and it resonated. You could feel it in the subtle ways students began to sit differently. The folded arms relaxed, the eye rolls stopped, and a few hands rose, not with hostility, but with curiosity. A student named Jaden, wearing a worn-out hoodie and the look of someone who rarely participated, stood up with a mic. You said disagreement doesn't mean disrespect. But what if your family or friends do treat you differently because of what you believe? The room stilled. Jaden's voice had cracked slightly, and suddenly, it wasn't about politics anymore. Karoline took a breath. That's a hard question, she said gently. And I've lived it too. She stepped away from the podium, choosing to speak to him, not at him. There was a Thanksgiving where I walked away from the table in tears. Not because I was attacked, but because I didn't know how to stand up for myself without losing someone I loved. She paused. And I learned this. Sometimes, people lash out when they're afraid. Not of you, but of what your voice represents. It reminds them of things they're not ready to face. Jaden nodded slowly. So, what do you do? He asked. You stay kind, Karoline replied. You stay calm, but most importantly, you stay standing. A quiet wow came from somewhere in the back. The teachers exchanged glances. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was something far more powerful, a moment of understanding. Even Maya, still holding her notepad, had stopped writing. Her eyes were fixed on Karoline now, not as an opponent, but as a woman who had faced what they all feared most, rejection, and stood tall anyway. The auditorium felt different now, not just quieter, but more alive. What began as a political appearance had transformed into something more intimate. The divide between the stage and the seats had nearly vanished. One by one, students raised their hands, not to attack, but to understand. A girl in the third row asked how Karoline dealt with failure. Another boy in the back wanted to know what she believed real leadership looked like. Karoline answered every question, not like a politician, but like someone who remembered being 17 and uncertain. Leadership, she said at one point, isn't about always being right. It's about showing up, telling the truth as you know it, and being willing to learn out loud. That last part sparked a ripple through the crowd. A teacher near the sidewall whispered to another, I've never seen them this focused. And it was true. Even the students who had come with folded arms and pre-written challenges were leaning forward now. Then came the moment no one expected. Maya raised her hand a third time, but her voice was softer now. What would you say, she asked, to someone who's passionate, but afraid of being labeled or judged if they speak up? Karoline's expression shifted. This wasn't just a question. It was the question. And Karoline felt it. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice low but certain. I'd say, if your voice makes people uncomfortable, it means you're saying something that matters. But say it with grace. Say it with strength. And say it knowing you may lose some people, but you'll find the ones who were waiting for you to speak first. Silence again. And then, clapping. Not thunderous, not staged, just real. Maya looked down, a small smile forming. For the first time all morning, the auditorium wasn't divided. It was connected. Because Karoline had done something no headline ever showed. She had turned a challenge into a bridge. The clapping didn't stop after Karoline's answer to Maya. It started in pockets, small, unsure. But within seconds, it spread across the auditorium like a wave no one saw coming. Students who had been skeptical, teachers who had been nervous, even staff standing in the back found themselves smiling. Karoline stood still, not soaking it in, but honoring it. Because she knew this wasn't applause for her. It was for the moment they all realized. Courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like a young woman, alone on a stage, answering questions meant to break her, with grace. After the applause settled, the principal took the mic. Before we close, he said. "I just want to thank Ms. Leavitt for her honesty, poise, and for showing us what real dialogue can look like." He looked stunned himself, like he'd witnessed something he hadn't expected from this visit. As students began rising from their seats, some made their way to the stage. Jaden walked up first. "You probably don't remember," he said awkwardly, "but what you said about staying kind even when people push you. I needed that." Karoline smiled. "I meant it for people just like you." Then came Maya. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside Karoline and offered a quiet nod. "Thanks for not shutting me down," she finally said. "That's rare." Karoline leaned in. "Challenging questions deserve thoughtful answers. You gave me a chance to give one." The two shook hands. Phones were still recording, and somewhere in the back, a student posted a photo with a simple caption: "She came to be challenged. She stayed to connect." By the time Karoline left the building, her phone buzzed nonstop. Clips from the event were spreading, not because of controversy, but because of something rarer: respect. And for Karoline, that was the most powerful outcome of all. By the next morning, the clip from the high school auditorium had hit over 2 million views. It wasn't because Karoline had made a fiery speech. It wasn't because she had shut someone down. It was because she hadn't. She had listened, she had answered, she had stayed, even when the room wasn't friendly. The caption that trended said it all. She didn't fight the crowd. She won them over. Across social media, reactions poured in. Teachers shared it with their classrooms. Students stitched their own reflections to the video. Even a well-known liberal journalist tweeted, "I don't agree with Karoline Leavitt on much, but that was one of the most poised public appearances I've seen in years." Meanwhile, Karoline sat quietly in a coffee shop in New Hampshire, watching the reactions. A staffer called. "This is blowing up," she answered simply. "I didn't go there to blow anything up. I went to prove you can be strong without being cruel." Emails flooded in, from students, parents, even former critics. One message stood out. "My daughter was in that room. She came home saying she wants to speak up now, too. Not louder, but braver. Thank you." Karoline closed her laptop and looked out the window. She hadn't walked into that school to change minds. She had walked in to be herself, even when she was the outsider. And that, in the end, was what changed everything. What happened in that high school auditorium had started as a local event, but it didn't stay local for long. By the end of the week, Karoline's quiet strength had sparked something bigger. Student clubs across the country began requesting her for speaking engagements, not just conservative groups, but civics classes, leadership seminars, even debate teams. They weren't inviting her to argue. They were inviting her to speak, to show what it meant to listen, to stand your ground without burning the room down. A college professor in Ohio played her speech for a political theory class. "Watch this," she told her students. "This is how you disagree with dignity." Meanwhile, Maya Ruiz, the very student who had led the charge against Karoline, released her own statement on the school's social media page. "I came ready to challenge her," she wrote, "but she changed the way I think about strength. It's not volume, it's consistency." That post went viral, too. Karoline was invited back to the school, this time not as a controversial guest, but as a featured mentor in a new student-led civic initiative. Even the principal, who had initially braced for backlash, admitted, "What we witnessed wasn't just a speech, it was a shift." Back in her home office, Karoline looked at the messages piling up in her inbox. Not all were kind, of course, but many were different. They weren't just fans or critics. They were people who had seen something they recognized in themselves: a fear of speaking, of being different, of being alone in a room full of judgment. Karoline's story reminded them, you don't have to change who you are to be heard. You just have to refuse to be silent. She stood by her window, holding a small card a student had handed her that day. It read, "Thank you for not backing down. I might not always agree with you, but now I know I can disagree without hiding." Karoline smiled. The room they once tried to turn against her, she'd turned it into a mirror. And now others were starting to see themselves more clearly too. 3 months after the high school event, Karoline returned, not for a speech, not for a debate, but to walk the halls as part of a student-led initiative called Voices of Courage. An entire wing of the school had been repurposed into a civic education center designed by students who'd attended the event. On the wall was a quote painted in bold lettering, "Speak when it's hard. Listen when it's harder." Inspired by Karoline Leavitt. She stood there quietly, staring at the words, not with pride, but with quiet awe. A student named Jordan approached her, holding a notebook. "Ms. Leavitt," he said nervously, "we're starting a podcast here, students from all sides. We don't always agree, but we decided we'd rather talk than tweet." She laughed gently. "That's a pretty good policy." Elsewhere on campus, Maya Ruiz, once her most vocal critic, was preparing to co-host the first episode. She saw Karoline from across the room and walked over. No awkwardness now, just respect. "It's weird," Maya said with a smirk. "You walked in as the villain in my head." Karoline chuckled. "And now? Now, you're the reason I decided to major in political science." That moment said it all. Karoline hadn't just endured the hardest room in her career. She'd transformed it. Not with slogans, not with shouting, but by staying, by listening, and by showing up exactly as she was. That's what students remembered. That's what inspired them. Back in her office that night, Karoline sat down and opened the handwritten letters she'd received from students across the country. One line stood out, "You didn't try to be perfect. You were just real. And now, I want to be real too." She tucked the letter into a folder labeled, "Not campaigns, not press, just people." And in that moment, Karoline Leavitt knew. She hadn't won an argument. She'd started something better. A conversation. She wasn't invited to be respected. She was invited to be tested. But Karoline Leavitt didn't fight back with anger. She answered with honesty. She stayed calm. She stayed real. And in doing so, she changed the room. This wasn't just a story about politics. It was about courage, connection, and the power of standing firm when you're expected to fold. Karoline didn't silence her critics. She listened to them, and then gave them something they never expected: respect. And that's what made her unforgettable. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Surprising Stories. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave voice to remind us who we can become.